And it's hard to make an argument that Punisher and Captain America are that similar. Now, they definitely have similarities. The idea that, Punisher is the next Cap or the heir apparent to Captain America, especially the mantle of Cap, I think that you would have to be especially dumb or really, really kind of out there. You have to take a long and very loose interpretation of who Captain America is to come to that conclusion. But, there are a lot of parallels to draw.
Let's talk about what Screen Rant had to say. On the surface, the Punisher and Captain America are two characters that seem like the polar opposites. Frank Castle kills those he deems guilty without remorse, while Steve Rogers fights for freedom and justice for all, only killing his enemies as a last resort, and usually only during wartime. It's clear as day that these guys couldn't be more different, or is it? Because honestly, I'm starting to think that Frank Castle really is the next Steve Rogers, and it only took me 19 years. And that is the basic theme of what he's going to talk about. We'll get into some of the specific examples, but the big difference is that Captain America is an aspirational hero, that's somebody that people should look up to. Punisher is either like a wild 90s style action hero or maybe even a cautionary tale. So I don't see how you could ever say Frank Castle could be the next Captain America, because he would never stand and embody the same things that Captain America does.
Yeah, they share some similarities. They both went to war. They both fought for their country. And they do both stand for something bigger than themselves. However, I think the fundamental difference between the two, while they both have kind of a very strong moral compass that generally always points north, Frank is formed different in that he is far, far, far more of a pragmatist, whereas Steve is absolutely an idealist. And I think that is the fundamental distinction between the two. Frank, being the pragmatist, believes that the ends do justify the means, whereas Steve is willing to tolerate certain things because his moral compass does not allow for him to take what he would probably consider shortcuts to get there.
Exactly. And I think a lot of this probably stems from just an amazing moment in 2006's Civil War, probably the best moment in the entire comic book. Obviously, it's cited here. The Punisher is fighting on the same side as Captain America, partly because he believes that superheroes and vigilantes shouldn't be registered, but mostly because he respects Steve Rogers more than anyone. Unfortunately for Frank, the feeling isn't mutual. Captain America has to think long and hard about whether he even wants Punisher to join his side. That's how much he doesn't agree with Punisher's brutal methods. However, Spider-Man reflects on Cap's decision and offers his own take on the situation, saying the two of them are the same guy, different war, which was very, very powerful stuff. I remember that being a very wonderful moment in Civil War. That's a moment where you stop reading the book and you start thinking. You're like, wow, that is a really interesting point that he's making, that Captain America probably inspired Punisher to be what he ended up becoming. Obviously, he learned some of the wrong lessons, but he's somebody that he greatly admired. He couldn't fight back. And we see that obviously sprinkled into the Garth Ennis stuff, but we also saw it sprinkled into the Jason Aaron retelling of the origins of Frank Castle, where he was a serial killer, but he always had his Captain America shield and stuff like that. So that is a fantastic moment that does make you really start thinking about the characters.
I think it's even a little more deep than a lot of people realize, because there are direct parallels between, where he says same guy. Yeah. Same guy with the same moral compass, different war. And I think you could take that on a lot of different ways. Both the war that Captain America currently and the Punisher are currently fighting, whereas Cap's is a more symbolic, I want to inspire people type war in his war against supervillainy, versus the Punisher's no nonsense, just get rid of them. But I think there's also parallels between the actual wars that they fought. World War II, when you boil it down, is a much more idealistic war. The distinction between good and bad was very clear. The Punisher, he got to start in Vietnam. It's a war that a lot of people, even today, sat there and go, what were we even there for? There was no idealism to it. They weren't fighting for a larger cause. I mean, you could argue that they were fighting against the spread of communism or whatever, But for the most part, we were there because the fucking French had a civil war in one of their colonies. And then the minute we showed up because of the Perpetual Alliance Treaty, they fucking jetted out of there. The second rule of French warfare, let the Americans handle it. But for the most part, we were there with a very unclear goal, unclear rules of war, unclear objective. As a result, it was just a war about killing the enemy, not so much about any sort of greater cause. And there's a direct parallel between who the Punisher is because of that war versus Captain America being in World War II and the Allied
But I also
powers.
think that it's really interesting that it shows the dichotomy and the difference in the perspective of the creators themselves. You know, Jack Kirby, Joe Simon, men that fought in World War II, had a different view of what heroism was. And I think by the time you get to like the baby boomers and stuff, and everything's a lot more dirty and grimy. So in one respect, you have people highlighting the greatest generation. And on the other respect, people highlighting the propensities of what I would call the most destructive, worst generation of all time.
The nihilism and the cynicism of the Punisher versus the objectivism and the aspirationalness of Captain America are very, very clearly differentiated between the generations of the creators.
Yeah, so I think that was really, really interesting stuff. And I think that's the beginning and the genesis for all this, where this guy's 20 or 19-year journey to understanding that these are two sides of the same coin, perhaps. You know, we'll kind of get in more into that. He then states that, you know, at one point in Vietnam, Frank Castle jumps on a man to save him, essentially his jumping on a grenade type moment, and then states Frank Castle may have started his military career as the next Steve Rogers, but because of the horrors he experienced during the Vietnam War, he was twisted into something much darker. Those horrors are actually shown in another Punisher prequel, comic by Garth Ennis called Born. In Born, Frank Castle is surrounded by enemy forces, and every soldier in his platoon is dead. He alone kills countless Viet Cong, and when Frank is finally pulled out of there, he looks like a feral animal covered in blood and surrounded by corpses. This is the moment Frank Castle became the Punisher, a moment Captain America never had to experience. And I do think at this point he is cherry picking a little bit, because if you go back to Punisher Knob, he wasn't like the most righteous, morally altruistic character in the history of the world. They tell him your unit's about to leave, and he tells his commanding officer to go over and look at the ridge because he knows there's a sniper waiting, and once he dies, he ain't going anywhere. You know,
Yep.
So you do have to cherry pick some of those moments.
Nobody's ever said that Frank wasn't a great leader, but he was far, far too pragmatic in that he would do whatever he could to keep the battle going and to come out on the winning side. And while Captain America had that same kind of I can do this all day to getting punched in the face, he's not interested in keeping the battle going. He's just interested in wearing out the enemy. Frank is about eliminating the enemy. We could say that his moral compass did point in the same way that Steve Rogers did. Sometimes he was willing to ignore it for the greater good, or I don't know if I'd say the greater good, but so that he didn't get deviated from the course that one minor circumstance would have put in the way of him continuing on that path towards objective.
Exactly.
goals.
That's the big difference. Is Frank is a man obsessed with his mission.
Yes.
And anything that happens that deviates him from the mission must be eliminated or ignored. Whereas Captain America is a man on a mission, but he's willing to see the true scope of what's happening and how this is going to affect things. And he's willing to have his mind change. Punisher never is willing to do that.
Frank doesn't know when to let go because he's burdened by some of the obsessive tendencies that Steve might not. And that doesn't make him a bad person in contrast to Steve by any stretch. It just shows that he did have moral failings that Steve might not have.
It shows that Spider-Man should be looking up to Captain America, not Punisher.
Absolutely.
Daredevil should be looking up to Captain America, not the Punisher. And that's why so many heroes have had problems with the Punisher, because he doesn't really abide by a strict code of morality. He's willing to cross lines.
And while he's always in pursuit of the same end goal that Cap is, his means of getting there are significantly different. And a lot of that is borne out because of the battles that he's fought, the circumstances he's been placed in. He was about fighting through the battles Whereas Cap never let himself get into the position where his entire platoon was dead. Cap always found a way to prevent that.
This is the final thing they said of note. Frank Castle wasn't fighting the Nazis. His war didn't inspire hope, and his suffering didn't lead to him becoming a superhero. Castle was a soldier willing to sacrifice himself for the men around him and for his country, just like Steve Rogers. However, while Rogers' war created a hero, Castle's war created a monster. Because of this, I would say that the Punisher actually is the next Captain America, but less a worthy successor and more of a dark reflection. Both men went into their wars for the same reasons, both fought with honor. However, their experiences resulted in two very different superhero alter egos. I don't think that in any way where you could even squint your head and like turn it and stuff, you can go, oh yeah, I could see Punisher's Captain America. It just doesn't fit. He's not worthy of the mantle.
No, and you can argue that, yeah, he is a dark reflection, but I would say he's more a worthy successor to, say, John Walker as the U.S. agent than he is Captain America. And Frank and John Walker have a lot of similarities as well, where they were great soldiers, that they were excellent commanders. They wanted the same end goal as Captain America, but they had moral failings that even though their moral compass might have shined into that true north direction, they weren't willing to deviate in order to get there. And that is because they became laser focused on the mission. And that's something that Cap doesn't have the same. I'm not saying he would compromise, but he would find a way to not have to go with that laser focus. He's still going to get there. It just might take a little bit more work because he's not going to just bulldoze through all of the things that are foundational towards, the freedom and liberty and everything else that he wants to achieve for everyone out there.
The coolest thing about it, though, and I like Punisher and I like Cap. I'm big fans of both of them. And both wonderful characters that have great signs and icons that go along with them, is they are a character study of where they came from. Captain America is a product of his time and what that America saw of itself. And the Punisher, once you start getting into Vietnam, is a product of its time and how people were looking at America and what it kind of represented. And it's clearly two completely different things. And that's why it comes out of there. And now we're seeing how people see America these days, and it's completely different than even the way that they saw him in the 90s.
At the end of the day, is Frank inspired by Cap? 100%. Does he want the same goals as Cap? 100%. The problem is he is absolutely a product of his time. A meandering war with no clear direction and no clear rules of engagement.
I would call moral fortitude.
Yes.
To believe in something to such a degree that you're not willing to ever give up, your core ethos. That is Captain America. That is not Punisher. He will do things if he thinks it, the ends justify the means.
Cap wants to create a world that he would be happy to live in. Frank wants to create a world where he knows that he doesn't fit in. His life is over once the world that he wants to create is real. Being as morally flawed as he is, doesn't fit in that kind of a world. I think that makes Frank more of a tragic hero than Captain America. Cap will always be aspirational and he will always try to be doing the right thing because it's the right thing. Frank will do whatever is necessary in order to get to the right thing. It makes Cap a morally superior character, but it might make Frank a little bit more interesting of a character.
More fun to read.
Yeah, probably a little bit more fun to read because he's not the Boy Scout. And that's fine, but don't ever confuse him for one.
Absolutely. And definitely shout out to Screen Rant. They don't often post articles out there that really do make you want to have a conversation about it. And I had a lot of fun here. Hopefully people have their own opinions on, Cap versus Punisher. Is Punisher the next Captain America? I say no, that's ridiculous. But there certainly are pieces there that you can compare and contrast that make a really compelling argument that there's a lot of similarities at the base level.
There is a lot of connective tissue at their foundation. They've just deviated so differently, but they will never lose that foundational connective tissue that they had. And that's the reason why, while everyone would probably say, don't do that, Frank would probably see himself as a worthy successor to Cap, but he wouldn't be.
Do appreciate that. If you like what we're doing here and you would like the full conversation, this is part of the Dok Unfiltered podcast. You will get it fully unedited, fully unfiltered, live right now on Thinking Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. You go there, you go to the Dok is Right tier. You get this, you get the Q&A, you get the Hot or Not show, you get the Sparrows, never-ending Christmas tree stuff. You get lots of it there. Hope to see you there very soon because we've also got an Uncanny X-Men review that's live right now.